Welcome to the first installation of our mock football season, and this installation will cover, as you can see here, intro to fall camp, but also some other things about player development, player ownership, player autonomy before leading into that. Before we start, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this journey here the next 12 to 15 weeks of tackling different topics in the world of football, hopefully challenge each other's thoughts, hopefully communicating, sharing ideas, and advancing and growing how we coach and prepare our athletes for football. And this is where we're going to start with, everyone's after wins and losses. And so what leads to more wins and less losses? And obviously, one is having better players. And depending what level you coach at or you play at, you can get better players, from a number of different areas, from whether it be recruitment or acquisition from a draft or free agency. But for the vast majority of us, the players that we have, the main area that we can have better players or create better players is through their development. And so this whole mock season is how do we develop better players, better decision makers, players that can help us win more games. And along with those players is that we have to have those players healthy. Success is linked to player availability. So again, everything that we tackle and approach with our athletes should be along the lines of developing them, but also trying to keep them healthy so that they're actually able to play on the field and make impact. And also, this is more from a football coaching standpoint, that everything is not tactical, and then from a strength conditioning standpoint, everything is not physical. If you talk to football coaches, they think that they can out-tactic every single opponent. It all comes down to tactics. If you talk to performance coaches or strength conditioning coaches, they think it all comes down to physical, being bigger, faster, stronger. And while those two things are massively important, they're not the only thing. And we're going to go into throughout the season of ways that I think those things may be overblown in some regards. So developing players and keeping them healthy, we can develop those players through our practice structure and schedule, through movement skill, and through strength conditioning. Those are our three main ways, as well as things such as nutrition, recovery, sleep habits, the other 23 hours, how they're taking care of their bodies are also vitally important for their development. Keeping players healthy comes down to, again, many of the same things: practice structure and schedule, movement skills, strength conditioning, then also educating and monitoring our players on a daily basis. As we go into here talking about fall camp, iatrogenic is basically an illness that is caused by a medication or physician. So early on, when doctors sometimes give patients medicine or some sort of medication or therapy, what this kind of term stemmed from was that these doctors didn't know how it interplayed with the current kind of state of the individual, or how some of these early medications would interplay with the patient themselves. And in many cases, what this stemmed from, this iatrogenic, is that illness was actually caused from a input or from a medication that was provided by a physician in attempts to actually cure them of some illness or ailments, or to help them improve. It actually made them worse because they didn't understand how all the interacting parts came together. And this is something I think about when it comes to fall camp, because fall camp is meant to prepare and prep our athletes for the season. But in many cases, fall camp may actually be in iatrogenic, meaning that it actually causes or disrupts or hurts our athletes' performance throughout the season, because we apply too much stress too soon, too fast, too often. And this stress is never overcome by our athletes for the remainder of the season. So before we get into fall camp, I'm just going to talk about some things that to me are vitally important for the players that are listening on this, how I coach my athletes, and I think how coaches could be better off preparing their athletes. And one is that play to your players' strengths. Okay, we should be asking our athletes to do things that they're good at. I see it, on post, game. As a coach, I coach college football. I see it on Saturdays after high school football games. I see it on Sundays after college football games. I see it on Mondays after NFL football games. Is that coaches will say our guy was in a bad position, or in coaches meetings, coaches will say this player just can't get this done. They can't get X or they can't get Y done. They're not good enough. When the reality is, we should be putting our athletes in positions or in situations that they're not good at. So if we're setting our athletes up to fail, and we bitch and complain that the athlete isn't strong enough or fast enough or isn't technically or tactically good enough to be in those positions, we shouldn't be putting them in those positions. So ask athletes to do things that they're good at, not things that they are not prepared for. And again, at the end of the day, it is about the players. And love the coach, but at the end of the day, everything's about the players. The players are the ones on the field putting the product in motion, in place. We have to gear things towards our players, not towards us as coaches, what we want done, our ego, or what we want to play, play this certain style. We should be fitting things to our player strengths, not trying to fit our players to what we deem as the ideal tactic or ideal formation or ideal play. Secondly, that again, this is a big thing that I try to implement to my athletes when I train them is understanding movement ownership. We should be playing at a speed that you own and control. This is something that coaches probably should be reiterating all the time, especially with the younger athletes. You're talking about high school and young college athletes. They tend to play at speeds that they do not own and they cannot control. When you do this, you're increasing your risk of injury because you're out of control essentially, and then you're also increasing the risk of other people being injured because, again, you're going to be not understanding what your body's doing in space. You're going to be doing things that you shouldn't be doing, and you're going to put others at risk as well. So one of the things that we talk about constantly is playing at a speed that you own and control. What this allows for, not only for safety reasons, but also allows for those athletes to have a deeper and more sensitive perceptual pickup of the environment and information. And this deeper, more sensitive perceptual pickup of information allows them to make better decisions, allows them to interact with that information more fluidly and smoothly and efficiently. If you watch some of the best athletes in any sport, they're always under control and they're always playing at a speed that they own and control. And that's why you see them not out of position. It allows them to be very adaptable and allow them to be very adjustable in very chaotic or complex situations and environments. And so we should be iterating to our athletes all the time. Play at a speed that you own and control. It's not always about going 100 miles per hour. It's about playing at a speed that allows you that deep and rich perceptual pickup, because that perceptual pickup is what the highest level athletes are very attuned to and allows them to make very, very good decisions and to be in very good positions to make big plays. Charles Darwin once said, it's not the strongest nor the smartest animal that survives, it's actually the most adaptable. And so adaptability, to me, is the biggest thing that we should be after. Our athletes having a vast adaptability or adjustability within their sport. And so as coaches, I think we should promote more exploration, more creativity, more adaptability in various situations, environments, and settings. We should be pushing them and encourage them to try new things, to be uncomfortable. We should be forcing them to actually try a certain technique, even though it may not suit them at that moment. But what that does is it increases that bandwidth of the athlete's kind of technique. It increases the bandwidth of the athlete's movement dexterity. It increases that bandwidth of what the athlete then can adapt to and create within the sport. Okay, so the best ability, some people say the best ability is availability, and that, there's some truth to that, but the best ability that our athletes could have, I think, is adaptability. The most adaptable athletes, think about the best athletes in every sport, they're the ones that are most adaptable to the setting, the environment, the situation, the area of the field that they find themselves in. They're very adaptable when they get stress or chaos in their face. So we should be building adaptability and promoting and encouraging adaptive movement solutions to complex movement problems.
You taught me a valuable lesson. You taught me be who you are.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the personality and the dance and all of that, because I used to watch film just like we all did, and used to do stuff. I was like, I can't do this. I was like, man, why am I trying to run my routes or release like Ocho when I'm 6'5", 230? You can't taught me a valuable lesson in year 4, bro. I said, I ain't doing that. The only person I really learned from, I felt like I could do, never mastered it, was Reg. Like Reg, bro, you put him in a slot, 2-man, cover 3, man-to-man. His corner routes look like his digs. His digs look like his out cuts. Everything looked the same.
So this is a great video because it's something that I struggle with as a coach, and I know as a player, as a player being in systems, I struggle with is that every coaches tend to make or want to make every athlete look and play the same, and there may be some value to. So in that case, Brandon Marshall, the guy I was talking to most of the time, the 6'5", 230-pound receiver, was trying to be like Chad Ochocinco. And there's nothing wrong with studying Chad and seeing maybe bits and pieces that you could take from his game. But we need to stop trying to make all of our athletes look like a certain prototypical receiver or prototypical quarterback, and start to let athletes be themselves and again play to their strengths. And again, there's nothing wrong with studying other people that may actually be different than your movement style, movement, technique, etc., movement body types. There's value to that, but at the end of the day, we have to let our athletes be themselves. And that means athletes will possess different techniques. That means they'll have different strengths. If we're talking about a receiver, Chad Ochocinco might be a guy that releases with much more quickness, much more variety of his moves, while Brandon Marshall might release more physical, be strong at the impact and throw guys away and things like that, and maybe not require so much of separation because he could box a defensive back out at the catch point, while Chad Ochocinco probably relied on more speed and quickness and more, deceiving his opponent and creating more space at that catch point because he was a little bit smaller and not quite as physical. So again, at the end of the day, we have to let our athletes be themselves. Be themselves and not try to force every athlete to look the same and play the same. So throughout this mock season, I'm going to give you guys a variety of different homework. So if number one is think about you as a coach or a player. What are some ways that you could encourage more adaptability, creativity, and ownership amongst your players, or if you're a player, amongst yourself? Look at your training programs or practices. Are there opportunities for exploration and autonomy? What are some ways that we could let our athletes be themselves and encourage them to, develop or master or their own technique and own style, rather than trying to copy or have you just tell them what they should be doing in every single play? So homework number one, hopefully you guys have a sheet out. Think about these things, and I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end. So now as we actually finally talk about fall camp, because this is kind of where most seasons start, we're going to talk about maybe some of the pros and cons of what happens during fall camp. Typically what happens is that there's too much too soon too often. So there's too much practice time, that the intensity is driven too soon, and we're practicing probably too often. And you look at the research and the science shows that preseason training camp has the largest increase in markers of muscle damage. And so what we think about, you look at the picture in the bottom right, the Junction Boys with Bear Bryant, is that we think that fall camp should be this time, this period where we're trying to test the athlete's fortitude. We're trying to push the limits of their physical capabilities in order to create some sort of mental resiliency or mental toughness. And that's just a wrong approach, because honestly, as a player, and again, the science will tend to point to this, is that many athletes may not actually recover from that physical load, from that increase in intensity and volume, in that muscle damage that they actually create, and the fatigue, the actual or the actual digging of fatigue that is created during fall camp. Many athletes are not actually rebounding or overcoming that throughout the season because they don't, or maybe not until their bye week, because of that increase, that tremendous increase in volume and intensity during fall camp. So again, this fall camp could actually negatively affect the whole season if we're not actually being smart about how we're loading up our fall camp. Also, dehydration is very common during fall camp and actually peaks at day 3 and doesn't normalize. Again, just dehydration, just getting back to dehydration levels or normal hydration levels takes up to 7 or 8 days. So over a week to normalize once dehydration peaks, and that usually happens around day 3, when the athletes are now, going from the summer, maybe training an hour and a half to a day, to now training to 2 to 3 hours a day, in August in that summer heat, not getting a chance to rehydrate because they're in meetings all day, or they have strength conditioning as well. So things like they're in a different environment. And so just being aware of just dehydration is a good marker of showing how long it actually takes to normalize. That's just pure dehydration. If we think about the whole system as a whole, how long that could take if we're not actually taking care of things during fall camp. And this tremendous increase in volume and load has been shown in injuries. We're talking about fall camp is, anywhere from 2.5 to 4 weeks, depending on the level you play or when your first game is. So that's roughly maybe 15 to 30% of your total season. Well, this has been shown that injuries in the NFL, roughly half the injuries, so 50% of the injuries happen before the first game of the year. So we're talking about a period that is only about 15 to 30% of the year, and roughly half or the majority of your injuries are happening in this small time frame. That just shows that this time frame is probably not being used very wisely if we're hurting our athletes in this small segment. And again, half of our athletes are hurt before even the main part of our season, the most important part of our season, the actual games. And so fall camp is a time when we should actually be getting our athletes through fall camp to play in the games, not survive fall camp and hopefully make it to the games. And again, fall camp, for those guys that played football, it's basically from 6 a.m. to about 9 p.m. at night, you have things going on all day, from meetings to a training table, to lunch and dinner, to walkthroughs, to strength conditioning, to practice. It's literally 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. all day you're involved in football activities. Well, can we reduce that day overall? Do we need our athletes up at 6 a.m. or even 7 a.m.? We know that the earlier that we start in the day, the less hours of sleep that our athletes get. They're high school, they're college kids for the most part. Okay, if we have something at 8 a.m., most athletes are not going to change their sleep cycle. They're not going to go to bed at 10 p.m. when they normally go to bed at 12:30. They're still going to go to bed at 12:30. They're still going to do those things. They're 18 to 22-year-old kids. They're going to do that. So can we find ways to push back our first training session of the day, our first, whether it be breakfast, whether it be our first meeting, whether it be training tables? Can we push that back to allow more time to sleep? Again, total sleep is very likely to be shorter during fall camp, 41 minutes. Again, 41 minutes is a significant amount of sleep that is lost compared to maybe during the off season. 41 minutes accumulated over the course of 16 to 25 days. That is a lot of sleep lost, and we know that sleep is the number one tool for recovery. It is the number one performance enhancer that our athletes have available to them, and they are losing 41 minutes a day because of how we're scheduling camp. Can we push that breakfast back to 9 a.m., 10 a.m.? Can we push some of those things back to allow our athletes opportunities to sleep? And here's another thought experiment. Can we give our athletes a day off during fall camp? Do we really need to go 20 days consecutive during fall camp? Can we not give them a day off at maybe day 4, day 7, day 10, wherever day it may be, multiple days off? If you think about this, at the end of the year, you finish your last game. Would you, giving the athletes a total day off from meetings, from practice, from walkthroughs, or even just from practice, you can still have a walkthrough, still have meetings, would giving the athletes 1 or 2 of those days off during fall camp really make a difference at the end of the year? If not, why not give those days off to allow your athletes a chance to recover and actually have more of those athletes be available during the start of the season rather than them being dinged up, nicked, or playing at a lower percentage of their max volition because they're fatigued. So again, I think most coaches would say you look at, come November, December, January, whenever the season ends, and they look back in their season and, someone told them, hey, you would have to take 1 day off or 2 days off during fall camp. Would it have made a difference in you and your record, in, the points per game and wherever it may be? I guarantee most coaches would say, no, heck no. So we can find days during camp to give their athletes a day off from that physical stress and even that mental stress and emotional stress of meetings, of walkthroughs, of strength conditioning, of training table, where they just have a day to get away from football. I think would be a tremendous benefit to our athletes. So here might be a couple preseason options. Maybe the first 2 weeks of fall camp might look like in terms of the day and also the intensity. So you can see here on the top there, we're not going day 1 with a high intensity load. We're actually going to maybe make that day 1 a little bit more of a walkthrough or more just individual periods and less of team and less of high velocities and less of high volumes with our athletes. And you can see our first high day, our first big day wouldn't be till day 4. Most high schools, colleges have to follow some sort of progression anyways of just helmets and then shells and then full pads. So can we find ways in our fall camp to actually progress our athletes slowly into a high load or high intense day rather than just on day 1 you're thrown into the fire. Day 1 we're gonna as a receiver, when I played in college, we'd run anywhere from 100 125 reps from indie to a small group with the quarterbacks to skelly to team. You're running a crap ton of routes, and for many athletes that's a huge jump from what they are used to during the summer to now all of a sudden running triple digit routes at full speed first day of camp. So can we actually progress our athletes into our training load rather than on day 1 expecting them to be high? On day 2 you see 2 low days, so maybe it's 2 walkthroughs. rather than just going right into it. And then both those days and both those examples, you have various opportunities and days for off days to throw in there, or multiple days of low days. So, low day might be just a walkthrough, might just be meetings, whatever the coach insists on that day. So two different styles that you could potentially use rather than the common template, at least when I played, was like every day was high. You'd have 14 days in a row of pretty dang high intensity, intense practice until you finally had a scrimmage, and then post scrimmage you might have a day off. That was kind of the only day off was after that scrimmage, but it was basically 14 days of high. And day 4 back when I played was double days started, so you had double days going on from there and out. So you really never had an opportunity or a chance to actually recover from some of those early on practices that were pretty intense. And at the bottom you can see there, I hope that no coaches are still doing physical or conditioning tests, whether it be before practice start or during practices. Again, conditioning we'll get into later on during the season is one of the most overrated things, I think, in football, that our athletes, you don't need to be super well conditioned to play the sport of football. We'll break down the bioenergetics later on in the season, but it's not an extremely difficult task to play a football game. Fatigue is much more than physical as well. It's mental, emotional, the ups and downs of the games, the tactical, portions of the game also exhibit fatigue. And so it's much more than physical. So hopefully we're not asking our athletes to do some sort of physical testing prior to starting practice, nor are we finishing our practices with conditioning. Again, it's just adding more mindless volume, mindless repetition, mindless pounding on our athletes' bodies that they don't need. You'd be much better off finding ways to design and implement your practice to get some sort of conditioning effect. But again, as we'll talk about later on, the conditioning levels that athletes need to play football are lower than most coaches think. So homework number 2, hopefully on that sheet as well, plan out how would you schedule the first 16 to 20 days of camp leading into week 1. So at the end of that 16th day or the 20th day, whatever days is your fall camp, and that's maybe a Sunday, and the following Monday leads into week 1. How would you design or how would you lay out that schedule? What would practice schedule look like? When would the days off be? What time would the day start? What time would the day end? Where would you plan in meetings and walkthroughs and training room and training tables and meals? How would you progress or implement strength conditioning or nutrition education? How would those things be laid out in your program? And then what would you emphasize during camp, both as a coach, as a player, from a developmental standpoint, from an educational standpoint, from a player health standpoint? What would be some things that you would emphasize or need to be emphasized during fall camp? Is it about mental toughness and mental resiliency, or is it about developing skills that would actually transfer to the field? So what are some things that you would emphasize during fall camp? So one of the goals of fall camp, especially early on, is to create kind of an accumulation of stress and contact. And so we just had it with the Giants, the New York Giants, just last week. It was the first day of full pads, like the 4th day of practice. The Giants did a full throttle, full contact tackling drill, and one of their best defensive players got hurt and I think is now out for the season. And there's different thoughts about why would they implement that this early on or whatnot. And, I think there's definitely value to doing full collision contact tackling activities. Now, maybe that was done too early in the camp for the athletes to be prepared for it. And so what I'm talking about is that there's a thing such as impact-induced muscle damage, meaning that the impact of blocking somebody, the stress and the fatigue of being in contact, colliding with people, is a different muscle damage than that of just normal sprinting, decelerating, cutting, muscle fatigue, etc. It elicits a different fatigue. It elicits a different physiological stress than those other things, and the body has to be prepared for those things. So a full collision contact tackling drill on the 4th day of practice, when likely the previous anywhere from 3 to 6 months the athletes haven't been exposed to that, is likely a bad idea. And we'll talk about some things here in a second. Are there ways that we can kind of inoculate our athletes and prepare athletes better for that contact and that impact-induced stress and muscle damage during the off-season or also early on during camp? And so that the first day of full contact of bringing to the ground, our athletes have some sort of reservoir built up to be prepared for that. Also, that goes to volume accumulation. So we're trying to reduce spikes in volume and in intensity with our athletes. Again, when the athletes maybe all summer was, sprinting 2 days a week, and doing maybe, 1 day of routes or run 1 day of practice or, whatever it may be, one-on-ones or on their own during the week. And all of a sudden now we're going to spike that to 6 days a week or 7 days a week for 2.5 hours. That's a huge spike in the volume and intensity that our athletes are performing these movement patterns, and also the volume of just the locomotion. So can we reduce those things and have a smart progression in how we're actually going to apply those volumes and those intensities throughout camp. So it's not just practice one, hey, you're prepared or you're not prepared. We're going to find out who is working in the summer. Again, that's a poor way to have our athletes going to camp. Like whether, we hear it all the time. Coaches are going to be like, we're going to find out who was working hard in the summer and who wasn't. You're going to find out who's working hard in the summer and who wasn't by the skills, not necessarily trying to run people in the ground and see who survived or not. So reducing those spikes in intensity and volume, or progressing these smartly so the athletes are actually prepared for those things. And again, at fall camp, I think would be a great time to establish athlete feedback and communication, and understand that this process, there's a lot of ownership and autonomy that comes back to the athletes, and we'll talk about it in a second. So here's another video where we talk about maybe some ways early on in camp. You can see these athletes here don't even have pads or helmets on or shoulder pads or anything like that. So things that can be done during the off season or early on during camp to, again, start to inoculate or accumulate some of that reservoir for that impact-induced muscle damage or contact accumulation.
Go! 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 Time! 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 Come free. Time! Squeeze them, time. Free. Good. Look at my hat. Come on, go. Good. Wrap them up.
So all those may not look like much, but it's a way to start to provide our athletes with that initial stimulus of impact and collision and being in close quarters with another individual. And again, that will allow the tissues and the body to adapt and be more prepared for the higher velocity, higher speed impacts that will come with full padded tackling. So this is something that I think strength conditioning coaches can be doing during the off season, and probably what the initial stages of fall camp may look like for the first anywhere from 1 to 7 days before we get into a little bit more of that full pad, high speed collisions and tackling. Again, we talked about establishing athlete education and athlete feedback and athlete communication ownership of designing out how practices look and getting feedback from our athletes. So this is just a simple session RPE, so rate of perceived exertion, where athletes will rate how difficult from a 1 to 10 or whatever scale that you want of how difficult that practice was, multiplied by the duration of the activity or duration of the practice, and that will give you kind of a session RPE that's kind of derived from the athlete. Again, sometimes our coaches' perception of how difficult practice is much different than the actual athlete's experience. And so, for example, from an offensive side of view, many offensive coordinators were actually, like, if you look back in their history, were quarterbacks. Well, quarterback, no offense to quarterbacks, is one of the physically least demanding positions there is in football in terms of a volume running standpoint. And so you talk about you go from group work with quarterbacks and receivers, and they'll run 60 routes, and they go to Skelly, and they'll run another 60 routes, and go to team, they'll run another 60 routes, and all of a sudden the quarterbacks coach is like, well, that wasn't too bad of a practice. Each quarterback only got a total of 45 throws, but the receivers ran each of them ran a total of 75 full speed routes. And so oftentimes position coaches or coordinators forget that the actual perceived exertion is different from positional groups. And just because the quarterback's day might have felt lower or easier does not mean that the receiver's day actually felt lower or easier, because they're the ones actually doing the kind of high intense sprinting, cutting, breaking, etc., while the quarterbacks are just taking drops and throwing. And they might be aware of that shoulder stress and shoulder repetition and number of throws that athletes get, and that's obviously very, very wise. But understand that for every rep that one quarterback goes, there could be 3 to 5 receivers going as well. And so for a quarterback may get only 15 reps, but that might be, a number of different receivers getting 15 or more reps as well, because each quarterback's getting 15 reps and they're going with multiple receivers. So it's a different perceived exertion for that practice activity than the quarterbacks receive than what the receivers receive. And so understand that there's differences between position groups, and it's oftentimes good for coaches to kind of lay out what they think the session might actually be labeled as. So we might go into a practice thinking, I want a medium day practice, so anywhere from that 500 to 700 range. And then I get feedback after practice that the athletes experienced it as a hard practice. They experienced like 900s or 800s from that practice. And it shows that disconnect sometimes that coaches may have from their players. So it's also a good educational tool for coaches to actually understand that, what they're implementing as practice may not actually be perceived the same as their athletes are perceiving, because they're the ones actually doing the physical activity. And we understand that we can't go from the hard or game like from, so say a session RPE of 800 or higher, we can't be having those days, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days in a row. We are going to kill our athletes if we do that. We understand that we have to have different loads, so a high day or hard day from a low day, maybe a couple medium days in there, etc. We can't just go high or hard days back to back to back to back. I think our athletes are going to survive. So it's a good tool for athletes or coaches to understand how to maybe wave load, so make a high day then a low day, a high day then a low day, or also progress that start of camp from I want those days to be low days into high days, and then we can finally get into a high or hard day later on in the fall camp. So it's a good tool. Session RP is a really good tool for coaches to use. We should also try to track sleep and exertion. You can start with this with a daily questionnaire score. So getting athletes to rate or score their sleep, their fatigue level, their energy levels, their soreness, and their mood are 5 really good categories to just track your athletes' levels or their scores on a daily basis and see how those fluctuate and undulate throughout the season. And also do this on game days, because what you might be surprised as is that we go onto a Saturday, don't we want our athletes feeling really good, fast, strong, healthy, and what you might be surprised as a coach sometimes is going into a Saturday where the athlete's daily questionnaire score on that Saturday may be lower than what we think they should be at. And so the athletes actually their energy level might be a 3 out of 5, and their soreness might be a 2 out of 5, and they might be a mood at a 3 out of 5, when we really want that energy to be a 5 out of 5, and soreness like a 0 or 1 out of 5, and the mood 5 out of 5. So it's a good indicator not only to do during fall camp and during the season, but also game days to see our athletes actually peaking, if you would, or feeling very, very good on game days, or are we killing them during the practice week? Or are we adding too much? Is there too much volume and intensity during the practice week that they're on game days are not performing at their highest level or feeling at their highest level because of the stress that we're providing to them during the week? It's very important for now athletes and also coaches to communicate, when sleep is disrupted for 2 or more days, because this can negatively affect the quality or quantity of the practice. So we want to look at that sleep quality or quantity. If that's disrupted for 2 or more days, the athlete is at a greater likelihood to experience an injury, and their performance is going to be negatively affected by that. So it might be a good day to give an athlete like a low day or an off day, or to give them opportunities where they can find more sleep, whether it be a nap throughout the middle of the day, or to push back the start of the day so athletes have more opportunity to sleep. Also, when the exertion level is elevated on things that typically should be easy, so things like a warm-up, things like Indy, things like light strength and conditioning session, when athletes are giving you feedback that those are feeling a lot more difficult, or their exertion levels during those is a lot higher than what they should be or what they were in the past, again, that is an indication of chronic fatigue. And so we have to understand that that athlete or those athletes in those scenarios may need a day off or may need more rest and recovery. So homework number 3 on that, what are some things that you could measure even with no budget? What are some steps that could be taken to keep players healthy during that fall camp? How could you manage player load and volume with limited staff? You're talking about a high school, you may only have 4 to 8 coaches, but you're talking about maybe from 60 to 100 players. How can you manage player load and volume with a small staff despite having a ton of players. That's it for install number 1. Again, you can please share, comment, post. That's my Instagram, Twitter. If you want to do stuff in there, that's fine. Please email me. If you guys want to send back what your homework responses were and answers were, please do that. Also send back if we want to create like a private Facebook group where we can kind of brainstorm ideas and share thoughts or answers to some of those homework questions on this private Facebook group. I can create that and add you guys on that. I'm not on Facebook a whole lot, but we can definitely do that during this next 12 to 15 weeks. But I really look forward to hearing what you guys thought about this first installation and some of your answers to those first homework questions. But look forward to continue to grow with you guys over the next 12 to 15 weeks, and I'll see